Hi, hello. My name is Wayne Modest, and I am welcoming some of you who join us again in our Thinking With series, a series of conversation that we have started here at the National Museum of World Culture's Research Center for Material Culture, which is a research institute for the National Museum of World Cultures. This series started actually within the framework of or after the lockdown and what within the framework of 2020 and what was happening in 2020 as a museum, and that prior to a series like this we were having in-person discussions around the museum, around its history, around the contestations around ownership of the objects that the museum has as ethnographic museum. So Thinking With was an opportunity to take the tense entanglement of the museum's history that ties it to Europe's colonial project and the material culture that emerged from that long history of relationship with the discipline of anthropology and what that meant, but also how that articulated with broader discussion about the present and future of these institutions in relationship to questions around property, questions around identity, questions around nation and nationalism and the boundaries of that. But also one question that has animated or thinking is how might we think materially with material culture, think with museums about fashioning better, more equitable futures. We have had different scholars with whom we have thought, such as Arturo Escobar, where we thought with Arturo around the question of the pluriverse, pluriversality, and what is at stake in thinking of other possible futures, other possible histories. We have thought about the question around implication and implicatedness, and what might the term implicatedness or the implicated subject that scholar Michael Rothberg has introduced in his recent book, what might that term do for how we think about how we live, for example, with the afterlife of the colonialism in the present. Today, our Thinking With comes from a different space. Actually, for the first time, we will think with a scholar, a thinker who is inside the museum. And I'll introduce her shortly, and that is Henrietta Lidchi. We will think with Henrietta and Stuart, who's written a book recently, Dividing the Spoils, or edited, Perspectives on Military Collections and the British Empire. This book sets out a very important challenge in the present, because we have for a long time in our museums been talking about the ethnographic museum and their collections. And within that framework, we've also been talking about military activity within the practice of ethnography and ethnographic museum collections that have resulted in objects in our museums or coming to our museums, and what that might mean around questions of who owns, what is the ethics of collecting, what might it mean for questions of return and restitution. But this book does something else, because invested in it is, as Stuart and Henrietta has opened up in the book, is not just the starting point from the ethnographic museum, the starting point from military spoils that are in the ethnographic museum, but to ask another question about what it might mean to think also from the perspective of the military collections in military museums. The question is then that emerges in this topic, I think, and we will discuss this later. What might it mean to bring these two disciplinary fields together as we critically connect with, think again about collections? What might this military mean when it moves across the ethnographic and the military historians as disciplinary practice? And one question that animates my own interest is what different values are given to these objects within the context of a military museum and the context of an ethnographic museum, and what that might mean for how we think about what is at stake with these objects in the present. By bringing these two fields together, might it allow us within our context, and that is always the selfish question that we ask from our perspective, but within the context of many other ethnographic museums, by bringing these two fields together, how does it help us to think again about the stakes that are attendant to now this dense discussion around the return, the restitution, around provenance of these kinds of collections in the present? So this is where we are going to engage in a conversation today. And I'm really, really happy that I have the two editors of the book, the two persons from whom it came, to think with them. Now, first of all, I want to start with Henrietta. And to be honest with you, I'm not going to read the bio as I've had it. I want to say that we work together, so I don't need this bio. Henrietta is the chief curator for the National Museum of World Cultures, but she's a long-standing critical thinker about what is at stake in the questions of ethnographic representation, museums, collections, what might, and many people who've read her work know of this wonderful article that she wrote around the questions of representation, the politics and poetics of representation. She's had a longer career thinking, and I must say that her capacious theoretical lens draws her from thinking about photography, but also she's working as an expert on collections from within the Americas, but also takes us to other geographies, having done work in India and other places. More recently, Henrietta has done amazing and important work in pushing an agenda at the National Museum of World Cultures to think again about questions of restitution and repair and return. And she was primarily, and is primarily, the trekker, the person who leads in our conversation around return of cultural heritage in these tense times. I want to also welcome Stuart Allan, who is the keeper of Scottish history and archaeology at the National Museum of Scotland. His specialism is in the material and organizational culture of the British Empire. And his research focuses on the Scottish military tradition in the wider cultural context. It is Stuart from that military perspective, and Henrietta from the ethnographic perspective, the anthropological perspective, for whom this book, out of whom this book emerged. It is through them that we're going to think, with them that we're going to think today, but also think with the concept of what does it mean to divide the spoils, and what is at stake in this idea of dividing, both in the worlds that the military created, but also that the ethnographic created. After they have introduced the book, spoken, we will have respondents from Staci Marie Dehaney, and I'll introduce her later, who worked in Jamaica around questions of military collection. And we will also have David Whetham, who is a professor of ethics and the military profession in the Defense Studies Department of King's College London. So that's the kind of stakes that we will set out today. I welcome you back. I hope you all are living careful lives in these anxious moments. And I welcome you to a critical conversation around military collections and what they might do for how we think questions of ethics, repair, return, collections in the present. Henrietta, Stuart, it's over to you, and I'll come back later.
Okay. Hello, I'm Henrietta Lidchi, and
good afternoon. I'm Stuart Allan, and thank you, Wayne, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us today. So what we thought we would do today is introduce ourselves a little bit, introduce the book. We tend to speak over each other, so we hope you will bear with us as we do this. And we will also do it in relationship to a set of objects that we will show you, since really our task is to think through these issues in relationship to collections, and especially the kinds of collections that are found in military museums in the United Kingdom. And when we talk about military museums in the United Kingdom, we are talking about those museums that aren't part of a national framework, but sometimes are part of a regional framework. So there are 130, more than 130 regimental, corps and military museums in the UK. So the book is really, as Wayne said, very graciously said, a sort of entanglement of military history and material anthropology, very much thinking through collections, thinking through the purposes of those collections. The book started out, in fact, a conversation on the stairs. So the National Museum of Scotland, where I used to work, has both a World Cultures collection and a military collection. And the conversation started very much in relationship to an object I was interested in and Stuart was interested in, which was a powder horn that came from the 7 Years' War in North America, that was both a piece of American folk art at one level, a piece of British military history on another, and had an indigenous made strap. So that's where our conversation began. And then we were trying to challenge ourselves about 6 years ago to look at really the colonial legacy that we find in museum collections. So to put the colonial back into collecting, that was one of our aims, to think through what colonial collecting meant and to better understand imperial military culture through material culture theory. So as a material anthropologist, what do I understand and how do I access collections in regimental and military museums? And I would say I expected to find exactly the same kind of objects as I found in the national institutions I worked in. And I would say that was an error. And I think as far as Stuart was concerned, it was, I speak for you, I don't mean to do that, emerging from our conversation was the fact that I found the collections so intriguing and so unusual that in a sense sparked off a level of critical inquiry. I wonder, Stuart, if you could talk a little bit about what or how an institutional context in a military museum is different.
Yeah, so I think this may seem a statement of the obvious, but the contents of military collections in some ways don't tell you an awful lot about military history, but they do tell you an awful lot about military culture, and that is the approach to the military collection that in the last couple of decades we've taken in an overt way at National Museum of Scotland. So the things that seem very obvious to me around the ways that objects represent military memory, military values and ideas about victory and defeat and the experience of being in war, the attitudes and assumptions that came as a matter of course with being a soldier. That in talking about these sorts of subjects with Henrietta, the realization that wasn't really widely understood, and that I guess the debate that Wayne was framing for us in his introduction was proceeding without any reference to those sorts of ideas. And while I wouldn't suggest that the contents of military museums are going to overturn or solve the debate around the meaning and future of collections and ethnographic museums, they cross, and their origins are similar in some ways. That the different paths that they take are enlightening. So I was keen to learn more about the functions of objects that came into other types of collection from as a result of military action, and from that point, somewhere in a conversation on the stairway, as Henrietta mentioned, you managed to overcome my innate skepticism and laziness And we started thinking about it and bringing in some more people to help us. And those are the people whose work is represented in the book.
Yeah, so one of the things that we were trying to do in the book is actually highlight a series of authors who've worked on these issues, either from within material anthropology or within military history. So within military history, looking at issues of culture and museums, and within material anthropology, looking at the kinds of collections that were gathered and are held in either university museums or national institutions. So obviously we don't want to go through our mutual history too long. One of the things that we were very keen in the project, so we've come to the end of a 3-year research project. This book is a sort of the first book rather than, and we're now writing a second book, was to evaluate and understand the institutional context of a military museum, its particularities, and its entanglement, let's say, from a private organization, a private military organization, entangled into a museological tradition. So it comes ported into a museum context in the 20th century. So to think of a military context more as private context, and in a way, and we'll come back to this, as contexts that have a kind of sacredness to them. They are shrine-like, and they require visiting as, so that's also a very interesting element. And I have been particularly interested in the idea of a relic, or the relics that we find in regimental museum collections.
So can I interrupt? Just say that the absolute key thing I think to understand is that I mean, if it was a surprise to anyone, the number of small military museums that there are in the UK, this is indicative of the limitations of thinking of military collections as a kind of state enterprise, or even as an imperial enterprise, because the whole culture and custom of the British Army and other European armies had versions of this to lesser degrees mostly. The whole basis of it was based on identification with individual military units that themselves had long histories. So these collections are about representing unit identities and kind of the ancestry of a particular regiment or other military organization, rather than presenting the kind of state picture of the army as the agent of national power. That's all in there, but it's not really what these collections were formed to do.
And the other aspect that we were really interested in, and we remain very interested in, and which Stuart has been working on intensely over the last 6 weeks or so, is the issue of governance. How, to what extent was, so as Wayne clearly presented, you know, our current concern, my work at NM4V has been very much concerned with those provenance of collections. How do we trace back and understand the methodologies by which objects were acquired, and in inverted commas, or I would say in military context, taken often. And so the question is, how do we understand, and there's been a big debate in the 20th century about whether or not these things were legitimate, but how do we understand the codes and governance of those activities within the 18th and 19th century within the British Army, and how that changed? Because there is no uniform moment when something gets established and then it gets obeyed, let's say for the sake of argument, for a long period of time. So what are the moments, and how the codes and conventions, how do that operate, let's say on campaign, and in different places at different times? So that's part of what we do in this book, it's part of what we're going to do as we move further. And understanding that, and you know, it's very important that our conversation about these objects, how these objects perform within their context, how they arrived in museums, and the effective values that are on them today in museums, is not a sort of apology for issues of colonial inequities. It is to understand what these collections mean, how we can critically engage with them, how we respect what they might mean to a group of people whose culture we need to understand, namely the culture of the military, as a methodology and way of disentangling the debates that we're in, which are heated and where there's quite a lot of conflicting opinion. So our desire to understand regimental and military museum collections is to understand it as a sort of a site where we can explore all of these issues.
So I think before we look at a few objects to try and flesh out what we're suggesting, I mean, I've buried myself in this for the last 2 or 3 weeks, so Henry stopped me, but just to set out the kind of essentials of what's going on. So the taking of objects in warfare is, if it's not an absolute universal through time and plagues, it's certainly ubiquitous in human culture, from ancient Assyria, Greece, Rome, China, Africa, and India before European incursions. It's in the Iliad, it's in the Quran, it's in the Bible, it's in Hindu precepts, not just about the taking of material, but also about the basis on which that is done. So the idea that the spoils of battle belong by right to the commander or the sovereign of the Victorian force, but that's a kind of trusteeship, and that there is an expectation that the spoils will be distributed, will be realized, the value of them in essentially in cash terms will be distributed through the victorious army. You see that through time, you see that all over the place. And also what you see through time is confusion and arguments about how that should happen, and also contentions about the parameters of what is legitimate for taking. So none of this is new, and none of it is clear. And the British system drew on all of these assumptions. The only stuff that existed in British military law was about the disciplinary aspects of plunder. So the main point was, you do not plunder from the enemy until your commander says you can. Because that is a breakdown of discipline. It risks the military objective. So that was the first point, and then everything out of there was this sort of form of custom and practice, and was then modified through statute law. But the idea was entirely that the amassing of this material and its realization as a kind of reward would happen. And then within that, it's the relationship between the financial value of plunder and the cultural value of trophy or souvenir. And it's really the relationships between these things that we're trying to get at.
So can we have the first slide? I think now people need to see visuals. Right, so this first contrast, this first slide, 2 objects that are currently in the National Museum of Scotland. One on the left is in the World Cultures collection, and the one on the right is in the military collection. And these were taken in 1868 after the storming of the capital fortress of Magdala during the Anglo-Abyssinian War. So one of the reasons we put this contrast, and this contrast is sort of highlighted at length in the introduction of the book, is partly because what you see is a sort of, they typify a difference between quote unquote ethnographic collections on the one hand and military collections on the other. Both of them, so in the underneath of the horn cap on the left is the registration that it's a horn cup and it's King Theodore's cup. And on the one on the right, you see that Theodore's cup is engraved in the silver mounting. On the left, it's a totally unmodified cup. On the right, it's modified in the sense that the horn cup is itself sort of mounted and has a silver ornamentation.
I should just point out here that the captions are the wrong way around.
Ah, okay.
Sorry, folks.
Oh well. And So William Mackenzie, who has the unmodified cup, bought the unmodified, is likely to have got it in India. He was never, in fact, in Ethiopia, but Paymaster Thompson was in Ethiopia and probably acquired the cup there. One of the interesting things about the cup on the right, this modified cup, is how prevalent they are in military collections. So one of the things that we found as we started to survey military collections, and we surveyed the collections with the postdoc who was allocated to the project, Dr. Nicole Hartwell, is that these cups are essentially representative of the type of object that comes out of the campaign. The unmodified cups, like the one you see on the left, are essentially in ethnographic or world cultures collections, and NM Feve actually also has 2 of these cups brought back by, let's say, a soldier who was allocated to the British forces, a Dutch soldier. And the one on the right are the kinds of cups that you get in military collections. So that's a very important distinction, because the notion of ethnographic collections is that they are authentic when they are unmodified. But the element of military collections is they become identifiable through labeling, through modification, and through inscription. And when we first started looking at these cups, Stuart coined a phrase which I think is useful, which was the notion of aspirational loot. So by that, we mean that these objects were taken on campaign. They were taken out from a looting expedition. They are unlikely to have been part of the prize system, but what they are saying is this belonged to Emperor Theodore or Emperor Tewodros. So in a sense, what they're doing is they're trying to produce a direct link with the military leader in that situation. I don't know, we can go to the next slide, and I wonder if you'd like to elaborate on this, Stuart. Yeah, so here are the kinds of objects that we have found in other military collections. As you see, they're all inscribed, and they were all taken by people on military campaign.
So every British officer that comes back from an expedition like the expedition to Magdala in Ethiopia is bringing back something for themselves. And these cups, well, so there's 2 things to think about. One is that they almost invariably say that they belong to the Emperor Theodore. There is no cup that came out of Magdala that did not belong to the defeated emperor, if you believed what you were seeing in the inscriptions on them. Because in the value system of military trophies and souvenirs, that connection to the defeated commander adds luster, adds value. So the cups were no more, Theodore's than anything else that might have come out of the fortress. And the other thing is that there's an emulation thing going on. So I'll have a cup, thank you, and they may well have been bought through the prize system, because the souvenir, the proceeds of the captured city were all put together and auctioned off in situ. But they function in military culture because of the situation of a kind of center of military social life around the officers' mess. So because they're drinking vessels, they sit quite nicely on a table or on a sideboard. So these are points of memory. So it's that interesting contrast between the unmodified cup, which goes into a national collection as an example of Ethiopian art, albeit that it was collected by a soldier, and a soldier who wasn't present, and is in a sense divorced from its immediate colonial and military context, with the absolute unedited, unashamed, and indeed promotional element of modifying, mounting these objects to make them speak of past military endeavour.
And so the other 2 things I was sort of pointing out was the fact that these objects weren't taken in one place and brought back to the UK. Sometimes they went through a 3rd place. So one of the ways and we know that is because the silvering, or the sort of embellishment in silver, is not always hallmarked, as would be the obligation for silversmithing in the UK. And so it is quite possible that some of these items were modified in India because a number of the regiments went from India to Ethiopia and back to India rather than come back to the UK. So that's one aspect. The other aspect that we wanted to highlight by this form, and we can look at the next slide, is essentially the role of these items in a private military life. So this, one of our colleagues, Nicole Hartwell, as I said before, has written in the book about the function of regimental silver. So what you have here, also coming from 1868, is a water jug or a coffee cup. It's a coffee pot. It's described sometimes differently, but in a sense, this is an arm defense. So it's a van brace that's been made into this domestic, completely transformed into this domestic object, but of course, again, inscribed so that the person using it or the person witnessing it will have a clear sense of where it come from and what its meaning is. But okay, we're a few minutes over time. Okay, so we need to hurry up. And so it's totally modified. However, if you look in the collection of the V&A, for example, you will have the unmodified van braces or forearm defenses. I don't know if you want to say, we can go to the next slide, which also does, so that's modification and transformation. And the middle item here is actually a sword ornament that comes from the Third Anglo-Ashanti War. And if you see, it's used in here, it's slightly modified. So it's a shell, it's a gold shell, but it's used within the context of this ceremonial culture, this private ceremonial culture of the military. I don't know, Stuart, if you want to say anything more about that.
This sort of thing. If so, I'm not a soldier, but I've worked in military museums and was a curator of a regimental museum. Just the surprise that this sort of thing strikes people as bizarre, and I didn't realize that, because in a military communal life context, this is kind of absolutely normal. And it's not, and there's no particular colonial message in it, I would argue, because this sort of adaptation of objects taken in warfare has a more universal application than that.
And so also the reason for having those slides is that you're seeing that actually the sort of sword ornament would have been a ceremonial object in an Ashanti context, and then it's shifting into a ceremonial context in the British military context. So it's also this sort of shift of one ceremonialism to another. At this point, we have another slide which we can talk of, and that's trophy. And I wonder if we could, I'll hand that one to you, Stuart, but also as a way of speaking about kind of governance structures and that kind of thing, quickly talking about that.
So I'll just to indicate that the idea of a trophy, I think we all understand, and the definition comes from the practice in ancient Greek warfare of setting something up on the battlefield, which was by the victorious army, which was actually the weapons and armor of the defeated force as a kind of temporary monument. So that's what a trophy was originally. But the setting aside of very fine objects that relate to the most prestigious aspect of combat, which would be the defeat of an enemy commander. So this Indian club or chob was well, you can read the inscription, was kept by the officer who took it as a memorial of his own part in the pursuit and eventual killing of a commander, an opposing commander in the Indian uprising. in 1857. And so you can see that the plaque has been added to it with that story. We look into that story and we find that some of the details have perhaps been embellished slightly, but this is set aside, and that one ended up in the World Cultures collection at the National Museum of Scotland. I think because its kind of intrinsic interest as a curio probably trumped its immediate function in a military culture.
And in terms of so there's 3 items. They were given these silver plaques at 2 different times, so 1901 and 1902, as you can see by the hallmarks. But the 2 interesting, and so one of the things that we're trying to also look at is vocabulary, and the kind of vocabulary that's used in association with military collections and these objects as they enter military spaces, but also non-military spaces. And here you've got the words. You've got the conjunction spolia opima, and at the end you've got the signature, the captor. So those are 2 things that we've also been looking at, spolia opima being the richest spoils, and also referring to a certain extent to the sort of classical education possibly of officers in the British Army, if I'm not wrong, Stuart. So that's also a sort of so we can discuss this later, but the prize system is also a system that divides the prize according to rank. So the hierarchy in the British military system is also evident in the apportionment of looted objects or prize objects. So can we take the next one? So the 2 big categories of objects that sort of emerge are trophies on one hand and relics on the other. And this is a piece. So essentially, we've been thinking about, so when kind of people from ethnographic collections, let's say people trained in the kind of ethnographic collection field, have typically gone to military museums in the UK, they've been searching for equivalents to their collections in a completely different context. And in some instances have emerged disappointed, because if you're looking for material linked to the Mahdi and the war in Sudan, and you work on ethnographic or world cultures collections, this is not the type of objects you would normally be interested in. And that's why a lot of these collections haven't been looked at. This item is essentially a piece of rubble, a piece of the building, on the steps of which General Gordon fell. General Gordon was the closest to a martyr, sort of Victorian saint, as a military commander could be. And what you find coming out of the Sudan campaign is a lot of this material that has the tone of relics. These objects that have a very high associative value. Obviously, the object itself, which is the piece of masonry, would quickly lose its identity in a museum collection unless it was encased in silver and unless it had the date when Gordon died inscribed on it. And as you can see, there's a cross. So it has everything that looks like memorial or it's to do with death. It came through the Gordon Boys' School, then ended up in Queen Victoria's collection, and then ended up in the Royal Engineers. And this links back to this category of objects that you find in military museums, which are relics and reliquaries. And I find that particularly interesting because it's almost like the object itself has an identity and an association. It embodies, it's not a representation of anything, it's not a representation of culture, which world cultures collections have traditionally been. It embodies a particular kind of memory and corporeal memory. And so one of the things that emerged from these conversations that Stuart and I have had is the very distinction between world cultures collections, if we think of it that way, which are collections that are usually built or have been built kind of from an Enlightenment rationale about representing particular cultures, versus these military collections, and they're about kind of living cultures. But these military collections are formed in a situation of conflict during the chaos of war, and in the midst of death. And so therefore, I feel that they have a very different purpose to do with memory and personhood than world cultures collections do. And I don't know whether or not, so when we've looked in military collections for world cultures collections, we are sort of looking for the wrong thing. It's sort of the conclusion of that. I don't know whether you want to have say any more, Stuart. No. And so finally, I think our final slide, so finally our final slide is an exhibition that we have at the National War Museum in Edinburgh, and it looks at the various categories of objects that are coming through this research. So objects that were collections that were created by people who had kind of aspirations to be collectors, objects that came through as looted material, items that came through as souvenirs, items that came through particular kind of ideas of recapture. So there are items made in Europe that end up being in other parts of the world that are then taken by armies back to Europe. So the souvenirs, so different categories of objects that we find in military collections. Sorry for the slightly exhaustive presentation. Hopefully something to sync with.
No, thank you, Henrietta. Thank you, Stuart. There are a lot of questions I have, but I can't think with them yet. One of the things that I just want you to hold on to is your use of the word taking. I'm very interested in that term and what it might look like, and that is also in relationship. I will say, to a book that was recently published by Dan Hicks, where he speaks about a theory of taking and what is at stake in that. And I really am interested to think with you, Stuart, because one of the things that we have within the question of the ethnographic is also the questions of disciplinary histories, right? What is the relationship between histories of discipline? So museums are organized as well around these. So an object might look different in an ethnographic and a natural history museum. And those emerge in different disciplinary ways. So as a historian yourself and a historian working on the military, I'm interested in that idea of the overlap between the discipline and the practice of thinking about the museum. So when did the military museum emerge and what is at stake in that? And finally, what excites me a lot is the idea of the sacred. I love that idea of the sacred and what it might mean that the military also go to the museum as a site for the sacred, because within museum studies as well, there has been a long discussion about the museum as a sacred site, as a temple, and what is at stake in the military, the temple, and thinking about that. But how does that, because one of the things that we must also admit is that as we look back at history and history of taking, we often want to judge how things were done in the past. And in a way, I'm interested in how we think about the military in relationship to these histories of violence and past violence and taking and so. So those are some of the questions. But now I want to move to somebody, Henry, thank you both. I want to move to one of our first respondent, and immediately I move to her and say to her that she's going to have to take less than the amount of time that she got. So she'll take a little shorter. And we move to Staci Marie Dehaney, who was the former director of the military history and library services and ex-captain within the Jamaica Defense Force, with the responsibility for the management of military heritage at the Jamaica Military Museum. I am well acquainted with Staci because she was also, Staci Marie, because she also worked some time ago together in Jamaica as part of the National Museum service there. And Staci has a degree in African history and political science and a master's in heritage studies. Staci Marie, the floor is yours, or the Zoom is yours.
Thank you. And I want to, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I think it's a very important discussion, having worked within a military museum and an ethnographic museum. Just the discussions of the partnerships between the two and the collections, I found to be very interesting as I went into the military museum from an ethnographic museum background and started to look for those objects and the discussions and the histories behind those objects more from an ethnographic standpoint, but then learning the military culture and the military approach to objects. So my comments here will really explore governance and the movement of objects through situations of conflict regarding the West India Regiment that was raised in the Caribbean in 1795 and the British West Indies Regiment that was raised for the war effort for World War I in 1915, also in the Caribbean. And the memorializing and how these objects that were taken, captured, loot, were memorialized and oftentimes misinterpreted as they took on different value systems within the military structure when they became parts of military collections. So for my first slide, could I have the first slide, please? Yes, thank you. So for my first slide, I look at the regimental silver. Now, Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templar, I think, captures the essence of military culture and the relationship with regimental silver, where he spoke of them as treasures, parts of the tradition of service, martial pride, and the heritage of those to whom they belong. They're all brought up to regard them as symbols of great achievements of the glorious past. These silver tokens are a constant reminder of the loyalty and deep sense of duty of our forebearers and an incentive to all of us to try and do better. They are part of the great tradition. Now, this basically embodies what it is that a trophy within the regimental silver represents for the military. Now, this particular object that's on the screen here is one of the 300 regimental silvers that are within the Jamaica Military Museum and Libraries collection that reflects the legacy of both the West India Regiment and during the period of British colonialism and the role they would have played within the imperial expansionism in the 19th century into Africa. Now, within these silvers are embedded the battle honors, which are given to the regiment on commendation for their role in the victory of a particular battle. Now here on this particular one, you can see the Ashanti, West Africa, 1873, 1874, 1887, 1892, Sierra Leone, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Dominica. Now, this particular trophy on your left, you can see that the staff that is embedded within the trophy actually comes out. It's the actual staff from a French drum major from the 26th Regiment that was taken as prize during 1808 during the battle for Marie Galante in the Caribbean. Now, Wayne mentioned the discussion of the word taken, and that's actually what's written on the middle plate of that trophy, that it was taken. And in recounting the events in a report, the lieutenant colonel who was responsible for the battle noted that the item was captured and is now in the possession of the 1st West India Regiment that was present. Now, it's not clear when this staff was cut and incorporated into the trophy, but one of the things that is very clear is that for silvers like this one, they're a small reflection of the movement of objects during periods of war and how they are repurposed during their lifespan within the military space. In this Now, one of the interesting things I would say with this particular silver, I think for Henrietta's presentation, there was an image that showed a table with some objects on display. Now that, from my knowledge, is a regimental dinner with the regimental silver that's displayed, which is a part of military tradition. And that tradition is to showcase the victories and triumphs of the, yes, that one. The victories and triumphs of the regiment and the legacy from which the regiment the current regiment has from the past. Now, in the case of the West India Regiment, a trophy such as this particular one embodies the idea of empowering the soldiers of the West India Regiment to build their confidence and pride as military men, as for centuries they'd be displayed on these dinners. Now, when we look at these silvers, they are a reflection of not only transference, but of the British imperial strategy during the period of expansion, a strategy that sought to create a third class. Could I get the next slide, please? No, that one. Yes. And to create a third class. Now, the West India Regiment soldier was neither slave nor free up to 1807, essentially, because they were purchased from slavers. There was even a recruiting station that was set up in Sierra Leone at one point to recruit people for the army, and they would have purchased from the plantations as well. Now, it's an interesting situation of having Black soldiers and having Black enslaved persons, and having the Black soldier be technically above the Black soldier, the enslaved. When you think of that relationship, it brings into question the role that these objects would have played in this period of slavery to create that idea of superiority and the indoctrination that these objects would have served. All right, so can we go back to the previous image, please? Yes, thank you. So this next object that I'm going to speak about was a captured kettle drum. This drum was taken by the 1st West India Regiment at the capture of the island of Guadeloupe on the 9th of August, 1815. It is one of 2 drums that was captured, a war drum and a death drum, only to be used at the time of an execution. In reporting the events of the capture of Guadeloupe, and the items listed as being captured and destroyed when the French governor declared Napoleon the emperor, and the British forces were deployed from Barbados to capture Guadeloupe, a special note is made that these 2 drums were now in the possession of the 1st West India Regiment, who participated, no doubt, as commendation for their actions in battle, as if they received the battle honors of Guadeloupe. In the previous slide with the drum major staff, Guadeloupe is one of those names that's listed. Guadeloupe is one of those names that's listed on the trophy itself as a battle honor. And then here we have the actual kettle drum that was captured from that period, and the plate that is in the middle states the history behind it as well. And can I get the next object, please? And what's interesting to note is as we speak about the use of words, there's the use of taken, there's the use of captured. But in this particular object, we now see a different discussion where an entity is discussed and highlighted as being consulted. Now, this is the Naharan synagogue mosaic that was revealed by Schelling in World War I in 1918. Now, this technically is not within the museum collection. It is actually physically within the Garrison Chapel of Ascension that is located at Up Park Camp. Now, this object is a 4th to 5th century floor mosaic from a synagogue at the Naharan near Jericho. The British forces and the Australian forces were stationed at the area fighting the Turks in the Jordan Valley in the summer of 1918, when the enemy shelling uncovered and revealed the floor mosaic. Major Ferber of the British West Indies Regiment presented the information regarding the discovery of the war trophy of the discovery to the War Trophy Committee. In the notes of the chaplain from the Australian Army, a portion of the mosaic was given to St. James Church in Australia for safekeeping, and another to St. John's Church in Brisbane as a symbol of the oldest churches of the world to the youngest church in Australia. Now, this account of the Australian bit of the mosaic is I got from a research from Alexandra Ariotti in Australia. Now, this mosaic is a very good example of the memorializing and the movement of objects in situations of conflict, but also that of misinterpretation and misrepresentation for purpose of memorial and victory. Now, research showed that basically this mosaic is a Jewish artifact architecture that reflects Jewish history and legacy that currently sits in Christian churches. Now, I don't know the exact location within the churches in Australia, but for the one here in Jamaica, it's located at the center right by the altar. Now, for the notes in terms of the placement, we know that the chaplain from Australia gave it to the churches as a symbol of Christianity of the old to Christianity of the new. But as the research showed, that this was actually from a Jewish synagogue. But the true legacy and history of the object is somewhat lost because it's placed within these spaces for the sole purpose of being a memory of victory of the Australian and British forces during World War I, and also a symbol of the Holy Land. So I think, yes, that one, thank you. Right, so for my last, this object is not one that I can show because this is a cartoon that shows the umbrella that was given to the crown at the end of the Ashanti Wars of 1874. Now you see the British officer handing it over and the officers in the background. Now I was told that this object is actually in the collection of the National Army Museum, but I highlight this particular object for this reason. The West India Regiment participated in the majority, if not all, of the campaigns during the period of expansionism in Africa. But yet we do not have any of those objects that would have been taken, captured, looted within the Caribbean. Well, to the best of my knowledge, that is. The Institute of Jamaica has 2 Ashanti war drums, but I can't say for sure that those war drums were captured during that period or necessarily authentic of the 19th century battles. Now, for me, this raises a very interesting question as it relates to military strategy and the relationship between, in terms of how persons would have received gifts or taken items from those items that were taken. So for the West India Regiment, the regiment was raised for the imperial interests in the Caribbean as well as in Africa, primarily because of it was deemed that they would be better suited for the climate. So they were essentially on the ground in all of these battles, but yet still they remain somewhat silent in the discussions of the provenance and movements of all these objects. And I would question and want to look at what is the relationship between the West Indian soldier and these objects and the movement of these objects. The highest rank a West India Regiment soldier could reach at the time was that of a sergeant, and the officers were white. So that is one thing I think that somewhat more research could be done that could look at the inner workings of the military of the time and the relationship with the West India Regiment soldier. And another question I would pose with the surrounding chaos of war is a possible role of collecting objects in furthering the imperializing mission through systematic breakdown of cultural, economic, and socio-political system in these areas? Is it possible that this was also psychological warfare and a military strategy under imperialism at the time, as many of these objects that were taken were symbolic within their societies? Now, there's an image that Henrietta and Stuart showed of a ceremonial sword that was which was repurposed within the military museum as a ceremonial design. And whereas we can look at that and the reasons why that would have been done and the transference of ceremony, I would also want to see how we could do more research into how were these items selected? Was there more thinking behind what was selected as actually part of military strategy rather than necessarily just financing the campaigns, or in cases where you had curators who went out to collect items for museums and as gifts and separates for the crown and the officers? Was there a little bit more strategy towards the movement of these objects? That's it for me. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Staci. In a way, actually, I'm quite happy with your presentation and how you ended and the questions you ended with. For a particular reason, there is a question, and I'm trying to find it now in the chat, where one person, Zinga Asanta, asked about a decentering of Europe from the narrative, and actually a centering of the perspectives of those who were colonized. And what you've done in the end and how you've shown it is that you are also speculating on a similar question that the person was asking when they speak about why was it so that the enslaved or the the person of African descent or African at the time were made complicit in the collecting. So I think that could open up an interesting way of thinking, and your question about it being strategy and what is at stake in that. One of the things that you said, which I found important, is the relationship between military taking and the periphery of empire, right? That empire has a broader geography and the periphery is Jamaica, it's the Caribbean, but what was happening to make the periphery also complicit in taking. Thank you, we'll go to that later on, but I'd like now to introduce David Whetham. And David, again, as I said, is Professor of Ethics and the Military Profession in the Defense Studies Department of King's College. He is the director of the King's Center for Military Ethics and delivers or coordinates the military ethics component of courses around 2,000 British and international officer a year at the UK's Joint Service Command and Staff College. Thank you, David, and it is yours. The Zoom is yours for now for a short 10-minute presentation, and then we come back to talk, all right?
Thank you very much, Wayne.
All right.
So I wanted to talk very quickly before I get into the meat of what I was going to say about. Stuart mentioned the ancient Greek practice of setting up trophies on the battlefield. I think it's worth just taking just a couple of seconds to think about the function of those trophies. In the ancient Greek context, this is so that you could basically work out which side had won. It's a way of demonstrating that if you're the one in control of the field and capable of building a trophy, then you are also the victor of the engagement, and that's clearly a very important function of the trophy. One of the things to bear in mind is that Greek practice forbade them being made of anything permanent. They were to be allowed to deteriorate over time, so as not to allow the perpetuation of the memory of the conflict. And I think this itself is a fascinating thing to bear in mind when thinking about what the function of the trophy actually is. I'll move on to spoils. This is basically the organized and systematic taking or robbing of items as part of a military operation, punitive raids, etc. And the subsequent distribution of spoils is definitely not part of the contemporary military doctrine, bringing it right up to date from ancient Greeks to today. Whilst we might find that some groups such as ISIS will find the destruction and looting of cultural property is in fact a carefully deployed military tool. Generally, it's now seen as militarily counterproductive by the West. Destruction or pillage, especially of cultural property or artifacts, can make occupied communities less easy to control and can provide justification for the next conflict. So there are sound strategic reasons for not doing it anymore. Therefore, very different to the context of much of the historical cases the project is concerned with. The deliberate looting of a state or culture's artifacts is now clearly recognised as a war crime. The moral obligation towards cultural property protection is guaranteed by the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the 1977 additional protocols. And it's now considered to be part of customary international law and binding on all parties in armed conflict, whether or not they've signed up to it. And these laws give special protection to cultural property, but it also enjoys a prominent place in international law under the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, and its two protocols of 54 and 1999. So this international treaty is one of the most widely signed in the world, and over 130 states are party to it. So these ideas are now mainstream and can be found in training manuals and courses all over the world. For example, it was surprise to many people that the Chinese military do a huge amount of cultural property protection training in Africa. The United Kingdom teaches cultural property protection alongside many other areas and has a unit dedicated to providing support in this area, so 21st century monument men and women. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Here's a case study from the Peace Operations Training Institute designed for UN peacekeepers. And it's designed to highlight how some souvenirs can actually help perpetuate the conflict they're supposed to prevent due to the fact that they may have been looted, therefore helping to fund the conflict, or may have been part of the outcome of ethnic cleansing. So there's actually a part of the training which is specifically focused on getting people to think about the implications of taking things out of a military theatre. So while the taking of spoils may have been replaced as a strategic aim, it's proved very hard to eliminate the taking of military trophies at an individual or even military unit level though. So next slide, please. Here's an example from the 1980s. This is Tony Banks, who served with 2 para in the Falklands. Now owns a chain of care homes in Scotland. But whilst as part of the Falklands conflict, he confiscated a trumpet from an Argentinian soldier and kept it as a war trophy. He felt it was unique. There were lots of berets, cap badges and bayonets around, but I thought to myself that this is probably the only Argentine trumpet on the island. And I imagine he was probably right. For a long period afterwards, the instrument he kept at home, and it was housed in a small black box with a music book, and the book itself had the name of the previous owner in it, Omar Rene Tabares. So 28 years later, in 2010, Tony Banks chose to go back to Buenos Aires to meet Tabares and return his prize. Interestingly, he's quoted as saying that it wasn't that he felt guilty about having taken it, but he felt that it was part of a necessary reconciliation. It's just something that he wanted to do. So, as he noted, the bugle was somewhat unusual compared to what most people were generally trying to bring back. from the Falklands. There was an expectation that people were going to take things. So, for example, the 5th Regiment of the Argentine Marines are said to have burnt their colours as they surrendered to the British to stop them falling into British hands. Other less contentious or problematic trophies come from many different military theatres and environments. So, for example, vehicle number plates or bullet hole ridden signs from places that that you've been deployed to or have fought over, flags or newspapers. I've seen this kind of thing myself just from doing election monitoring in post-war countries such as Kosovo. So if you wanted to bring something like that back, the current rules are basically that they must, for safety, they must comply with the same rules and procedures on taking items on military flights, would be the same as for civilian flights. So if you weren't allowed to take it on a civilian flight, you're probably not allowed to bring it home. Although prohibited today, there's no doubt that the most prized of trophies, just as they probably were 100 years or 200 years ago, would be weapons. Now, today, there is actually a legitimate way of doing it. You can make an official request to seniors who must be, who may choose to allow you to do it through formal application. The weapon would have to be deactivated, but either way, it's up to your superiors to decide whether or not it can be brought. But of course, that doesn't stop people trying to get around the rules. Apparently, as the Falklands ships returned home at the end of the conflict, and all of the soldiers were routinely warned to get rid of hoarded Argentine weapons, apparently you could hear the ship was surrounded by splashes as the pistols went overboard. Next slide, please. More recently, Sergeant Danny Nightingale was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment for keeping a 9mm Glock pistol, which he was given to him as a present in Iraq, he claimed. I note he also had 338 rounds of ammunition on him, so it wasn't simply a gun. It was also a usable weapon, and probably demonstrates why this particular incident was taken so seriously. Now, he was later released on appeal after his sentence was reduced and then suspended. But one of the witnesses at Sergeant Nightingale's trial said, "I know it's illegal, but it's kind of part of the course." Older N was claimed to have said. He said, sorry, not claimed to have said this in court. "You go on operations, you want to bring back a trophy, as our grandfathers did in the war. To bring back a trophy of some sort is kind of semi-okay." That was the view from one of his Sergeant Nightingale's comrades at his trial. But even with this, everyone supposedly knows that you can't steal off someone anymore. So, for example, taking a gold cross from around the neck of a POW or something, that's clearly pillaging. And it's this that tends to be the most shocking examples of what we might see today. So I was involved in a small way in the Afghanistan inquiry into the allegations of war crimes committed by Australian SAS soldiers. And whilst there's an awful lot more to worry about than trophy hunting, next slide, please. This photo from 2009 was taken in Afghanistan, and it shows a soldier from the regiment drinking out of a prosthetic limb at an unofficial bar known as the Fat Lady's Arms. And the fake leg is believed to have been removed from an Afghan amputee who was killed during a raid in April 2009. The bar itself wasn't permitted in the Afghanistan operational theatre, but somehow managed to get resupplied through the military system. So whilst unofficial, it was obviously tolerated. As an adapted drinking cup, while perhaps more shocking than some of the examples that we saw earlier, it's not a million miles away from the adapted relics used as drinking vessels we saw earlier. While when not being used as a cup, it was mounted on a board as a squadron trophy, which I think fits very closely with the relic, almost shrine-like nature of the artifacts that Henrietta was mentioning earlier. Now, after the deployment, it was apparently brought back to Special Forces HQ in Australia, and it's difficult to see how this wasn't tacitly endorsed by senior leadership. As the inquiry report makes clear, this was likely a symptom of other more profound issues which the unit was involved with. It shows how the regimental trophy system lives on, perhaps not as formally, but it's still there. And I shall finish there.
Because we've run over time. David, you did two things that I think are quite important. And I'd love to have a longer conversation with you about this. We might not be able to do that today. But what you mentioned about the question of ethnic cleansing and how do we trace a genealogy of war, ethnic cleansing, and the taking of goods? So, you know, at what moment and who is in the framework of defining what ethnic cleansing is, and at what moment, and how does that tie to the question of colonialism, right? And materiality. That was one thing I'd love to be able to discuss. And the second thing would be your attempt to clarify Stuart's issue with relationship to the ancient Greeks. And I'm particularly interested in that. Everybody who knows me knows that I'm involved in a certain kind of thinking critically, conceptually, but contentiously about these topics. And one of the things that is overlapping with this conversation that you mentioned is a conversation around the question of slavery and enslavement, to tie it with Staci. And we often hear that slavery was from all times. The ancient this did it as well, right? So what is the clarification that you're making to suggest that the trophy of the ancient Greeks might be different from what is happening now, or might be similar? I'd be interested in that. Now, can we bring everybody together? I don't see Stuart, I don't see Henrietta, and I don't see Staci Marie, so I think it would be nice if we could see them. And before I do that, I want to open the possibility for Henrietta and Stuart to respond first to any of the many questions everybody has asked, taking whatever. And then I want to actually go to the chat and the questions that are being asked, because there are some pressing questions there, and I want to ensure that we at least attend to our community, the 111 people who are with us today. So Henrietta, Stuart, go ahead and take which one you want and start answering. Taking is a lovely one to start with, if I may say, but there are other things that you can answer. But before we leave, one of the things that I need you to answer is, what is the analytical yield that one gets by taking the military museum into account, or not, as we think about these present day conventions, conceptions around return, repair, restitution, that kind of thing. And I'd love you to answer Staci's question about strategy. It is a strategy of, tying back with Stuart, of possibly, if I may use a strange term, cultural genocide or ethnic cleansing. All right?
I'll kick off, why not? I think that the whole series of categories that we, what is the theoretical payoff, let's say that. So I think the theoretical payoff is in recalibrating how we think of non-military collections in relationship to these military collections. So those military collections essentially interrogate the non-military collections. And they interrogate them because they interrogate, I would say, the processes by which objects, let's say, gravitate towards national institutions. So I tend sometimes, just for the sake of argument, to say the trophies are in the nationals and the relics are in the military museums. And the reason that we say that is because the trophy has a very particular, as David has really shown, it has a particular set of associations with it, which we need to understand. So, and I notice a colleague from the V&A is part of the attendees, but you know, there's a chalice and a crown in the V&A that was subject to an extensive parliamentary debate in 1871 about the nature of a trophy, whether a national institution should be buying trophies, whether they should buy division, you know, material that was taken in prize. And I think we we've become sort of habituated in world cultures conversations to a particular set of relationships between and things that we're trying to unravel. And I think on one hand, Staci Marie's question, which is, well, what were these, so what is the relationship between, let's say, the British officers and the forces that came from other parts of the world? So the British Indian Army, the West India regiments. How was this material? And Benin is another illustration. So why is material going up the coast from after the punitive expedition or the 1897 attack on Benin City, but other material is coming to the UK and being sold at auction? Do we understand those relationships? And since we have expunged, I would say, in world cultures collections for quite a long time, the veneer of the military, we have to understand what the military was up to and what its strategies were and how the relationship between sort of colonial wars and imperial dominance in order to understand the nature of our collections and the strategies by which they arrived. And in military collections, you do have words like taken, found, discovered, captured, trophy, relic. So you have all of these words within the documentations and accounts themselves. And I think that does challenge you to understand what it is you're looking at. You're not neutralizing it by putting it through an art history system, which essentially produces art as a trophy or trophy as art. And that's what you're trying to do. And I think so you are actually trying to have a conversation from inside the rationale at one level. And you're also trying to understand who's doing what in which part of the world and when, to answer Staci Marie's question. That's my version of it.
All right, Stuart, do you want to respond quickly, and then we open up for another question?
Okay, so you'll see all these words, taken, captured, so forth. You won't see the word stealing, stolen. And I think this is about offering an understanding of what was felt to be legitimate. Now, this isn't me saying is legitimate. It is about understanding that there was something in operation which were the rules of war as they were understood, and that something else is happening cumulatively that is to do with empire. And I don't think we really fully understand how these two things interact. And my sense of it is that it wasn't particularly strategic. It wasn't particularly, and it did tend towards the chaotic. So in relation to the debate that Henry mentioned, with the about what to do with the crown and chalice taken from Ethiopia. There was an argument about what to do with this stuff because no one really knew what to do with it. The commander was suggesting it should be kept as a symbol of British authority and dominion over Ethiopia, and then returned to the emperor that they appointed as a kind of a client emperor. That didn't happen in the end. But there wasn't. I don't think there was a system I don't think there was a systematic effort to treat this material in a particular way that everyone was agreed on. So I think we are dealing with a kind of chaotic set of actions, the sum total of which leaves museums with this issue now. Can I just specifically come back to David's point about the trophy? One of the things that struck me about this is that the temporary nature of the trophy in Greek warfare that David mentioned applied to warfare between Greeks and other Greeks, okay? Permanent monuments were erected when the Greeks fought outsiders, as they saw them, aliens, so the Persians. And there is an instance of, I think it's the Battle of Leuctra, where the Thebans complained that, or the Spartans, the defeated Spartans complained that the victorious Thebans hadn't taken the monument down. They built something permanent, and that was not the rules of war. And it just struck me that that was about equality, and that we're left with objects as permanent trophies in a world where we now wish to see ourselves as equals within the wider international community. And there we've got this problem of permanence.
All right,
And
I think,
everyone-
sorry. I think that this is beautiful. And first of all, I just really apologize to the audience because we're already running late. So I'm going to ask them for extra 15 minutes of their time. But before Henrietta, you come in, and sorry to do this. This is the way where my work emerges from. But if I were to bring together that very notion, the leaving into permanence, something which speaks to questions of equality and legality or legitimacy. If I bring that together with Staci Marie's question around the broad geography of the military, then my question to you, Stuart, would be, and sorry to ask this is where my work is, but even if there was chaos, is chaos based on a structuring force of, for example, the colonial, which is a racializing logic that says that chaos still has a sort of structure, but the structure is underlying what seemed to be chaos. If you understand what I mean, there is chaos. Yes, you take this, you take that, you take that, but there's something else that is structured into the chaos, which is what you call the law or legality or legitimacy that is somewhat structured. There could be structure which is racialization or colonialism. Is it just chaos though?
No, I think what you have is the chaotic circumstances of war. You've got the assumptions and conventions of what is done in battle, and you have got the changing and growing imperial dimension about imposing a sort of a racially ordered domination on the world, and these things come together. I would suggest, and that we don't really understand that process if we don't understand the bit that is about the wider cultural practices of warfare. Yeah, and that's not an answer to the problem.
But I think it is beautiful that you said that, because I mean, one of the things that we struggle with in the Ethnographic Museum, and I think especially since Tony Bennick's book was published of The Birth of the Museum, is that all of us now think that all collecting practices were structured, ordered, normalized, very fixed according to a Foucauldian model of power, and we know that it is also a little bit messy. Much of it is also messy. Before Henrietta, I want you to take this question by Esther. Thank you, Henrietta and Stuart, for your interesting presentation and introducing the various objects. These were objects that were taken, indeed, as trophies or relics by the military. I was curious, Esther Captain says, whether you are also aware of similar objects that were used to fight the colonial oppressor, such as was the case for the Kris Pusaka, the dagger which was used by Indonesians to fight the Dutch and is considered an international heirloom. So she's asking from the other perspective. I use this moment to further the answer that you wanted to do for Stuart as well. No, this is for Henry.
Yeah. No, so I suppose to me, the question, it was more to do with the question of the fragments. So what is, when we look at museums and we look at museum collections, we tend to think of them as having a logic that is, as you quite rightly said, like Tony Bennett, that has this kind of logic. And the Imperial Archives, Richard's notion is that, you started building up these collections and then they created entropy. And one of the problems with military museums is when ethnographers go and look at them, they always look chaotic. So I think what we're trying to say, so one of the questions is weapons, actually, and that's the question that David brought up. So is the category of a weapon a very different category and has different sorts of commissions attached to it? And are there different types of relationships taking those kinds of objects that there are taking other kinds of objects? And I think there are different types of objects that come into play during these colonial wars. So there's the trophies that get surrendered to the crown, the royal collection, for example. There are the trophies that people take for themselves. They are the relics that sort of attach themselves either to an enemy commander or an actual British commander. So we've looked at things to do with the mutiny, the Indian Mutiny or the Indian Uprising or the Indian Rebellion. and all of the sort of sentiment attached to those, these sort of memorials and memento moris that come from that. So different conflicts are actually generating, that's the other thing, different conflicts are generating different categories of objects in different quantities. In regimental museums, even if, you know, national institutions are collecting them as art or trying to represent sort of the artifacts of another part of the world. In terms of captured weapons, I think that, which is sort of, so the kriss is symbolic, it's a sign of power, but it's also a sort of symbolic weapon. So I don't know to what extent Stuart can talk to, I mean, there's all of the swords that are linked to Tipu Sultan and that kind of thing, and the armories and those kinds of objects, rather than the material that you might pick up on a battlefield.
So probably the highest status, if you like, military trophy or category, you could argue, is the sword of the defeated commander. That has a special cachet, and in certain circumstances, the defeated commander, if he's alive, has to hand over ceremonially the sword to his victorious opponent as a ritual of who has won and who has lost. Some years ago, as many other museums in the UK, we at National Museum Scotland have material from the defeat of Tipu, Sultan of Mysore in southern India in 1799. And again, there are more swords of Tipu Sultan than any man could need, because actually what happened was that the armory was looted. And the weapons were distributed, and they're all, you know, they're all described as the sword of Tipu. But there was one which was the one that was allotted to the victorious British commander, who happened to be Scottish, and it was on loan to us for a long time. And it was then withdrawn from the museum and sold at auction, and it was bought by a private individual, by a collector in India. And the interesting thing about, or there were many interesting things about that process, but it was displayed, paraded by the buyer, by the new owner in India as a trophy that had been brought back and had been prized from the European museum, European auction system. So the kind of complex life of this object seems to speak about how the power invested in these objects continues.
All right, I want to invite David and Staci Marie to respond in any way they want. But Staci Marie, there is a question from Zinga Asanta. Or not really a question, it is a statement, but I think it could be formulated as an important question. Zanga basically suggests that the more voice should be given to the formerly colonized, and what I have called at the periphery of empire, you know, the formerly colonized, to have a voice in how we discuss, interpret, think through these objects, right? So I think in a way what Zinga Asante is speaking about as well is that very often the discussion, even around the question of restitution, return, and whatever, is a particular kind of European discussion, right? So my question to you is, from the perspective of being in Jamaica, working in Jamaica, in the army in Jamaica, and also, let me say, if you feel that it is too vulnerable that you can't say anything because the army is going to come for you. Or whatever, you don't have to do that. Especially the colonel, who is our good friend.
Well, I'm no longer in the army.
Oh yeah, you're no longer in the army. So what do you think are the stakes there for the questions that one needs to ask around these objects from the perspective of Jamaica? What are the stakes for the army in Jamaica to think through these questions around what is a military collection and what is at stake in that? And do you think that they are very different in that sense from from the position of the book, whose starting point was the British, perhaps in a narrower sense than we could expand the British that owned a large part of the world at some point or conquered.
Well, I think from Jamaica, it's a very interesting perspective of the Caribbean regiments, because these were Black men who didn't exactly volunteer in the case of the West India Regiment, but they were indoctrinated that they're a part of an empire and they were fighting as part of an empire, but their freedom to a large extent was to the permit of the garrison. And there was a discussion of how free were they within the state of slavery. So it's interesting in terms of the objects that were taken, because as I mentioned, for many of them, that they would have been Africans who would have just come from Africa being purchased from slavers. So in going back to West Africa, I can't verify in terms of where exactly they would have come from, but there is that relationship that they would have had in terms of being back home to some extent. And certainly here in Jamaica, it's the state of the Creole. So I think for us in the post-colonial within the Caribbean and our collections, I think it's important for us to basically look deeper within these campaigns, to locate the West Indian soldier, to locate the King's Rifles, to locate the Africans within these battles, to look at what the negotiations were, what the relationships were that they had with the locals. And in looking at the movement of these items, where were they? Because a large part of what I've seen in terms of even the research generally is that there isn't much research that has been done into the African presence within these campaigns, but yet they were raised for the purpose of protecting imperial interests in Africa. But the collections are in Europe and they're not mentioned as being present at these battles, because even for some of the exhibitions in the UK, it states the Ashanti expedition of whatever period, but it doesn't mention that this was actually a Black regiment that was there by white officers who were also part of the regiment or attached from other British regiments. But the relationship between that needs to be explored, as well as just locating and bringing to the fore the Black person within these discussions and the movement of these objects and the relationships that they had with them. I don't know if that answers the question.
David, we're going to soon wrap up. Geez, the time is running out. Whoa. David, any initial responses? You can go back to the question of the ancient Greeks, of course, which I asked you, and the question of ethnic cleansing. You can go back to any of those. One of the interests that I have as I read your CV, and Henrietta had already long time ago suggested that I contact you, sorry for not doing that, is the question of ethics. I'm interested in that question of ethics, right? And what is at stake in ethics, taking objects and so. But how would you respond from that thinking military ethics to or what does the book do? What does the work of Henrietta and Stuart do for us to think again about military ethics in relationship to questions of materiality and taking?
There's so many different areas that I could pick up with that, and we don't have any time to explore any of them. I think I'll link it back to something that Stuart and I have effectively been discussing, and that's this role of the trophy, and it's I think the point you made there is absolutely fascinating and spot on, and it's about the equal nature of the two sides. It's the moral equality of competence, if you want to put it into ethical terms. The idea that the other side, we might be fighting them, but that doesn't mean that they think they're wrong. They think they're right in the same way that we think we're right. And that is the basis of the moral equality of competence. It doesn't mean that you're not going to try and defeat them, but you have to recognize that they genuinely think they are doing the right thing as well as you are. And that's why intra-Greek ancient warfare was a battle of equals, and there was once one side had defeated the other, then that was accepted. There were clear criteria to decide who had won, who had lost. Apart from the trophy, if you were the one asking to get your dead back, then you're the one who's lost. You're coming up to the trophy that's being built, and you're saying, "Can we collect our dead, please?" It's a pretty clear indicator that you're the one on the losing side. But what we're seeing now is this process, the colonial period, where the moral equality of competence is not assumed. It's not taken as we're not fighting equal. The West is not fighting in its colonial wars anybody it considers to be a moral equal under any circumstances. And what you're seeing now, I think, is beautifully articulated by the discussions that we're having now, and the questions that are coming up on the timeline, is this idea that we're very uncomfortable with that now. We've got a load of stuff which is basically demonstrating that we were not considering people to be morally equal to us historically. That view, hopefully, has now fundamentally changed, and now we're left with an enormous legacy, which is really difficult to know exactly what to do with it. Do you just keep it as a record of past wrongs and say, this is what has happened, we don't want to do this again? Or one of the reasons I included that Falklands bugle example was the idea that on an individual level, the person who took that decided 28 years later to go and return it to the person who he had confiscated it from at the time. He felt that was important for reconciliation, and I think that is a pretty powerful statement, which whilst that was at the individual level, I think that tells us a lot about perhaps how we should be thinking about things at the macro level as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. I want to kind of close with two questions. There is one from Sophie Lovegrove that says, another question, if there is time, there's a little time. I was wondering what might have been and continues to be the role of such trophies or relics taken during colonial conflicts or wars, and particularly their display in museums. Why were they displayed in museums? And did that have anything to do with the normalizing or the legitimizing of colonial violence? So this moves away from the relic itself and asks a question about the museum as form. What was the display doing?
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so if we're talking about military museums here, I think that is an important distinction. I think this question gets at the hybrid nature of what a military museum is in the UK today, because these are collections that began as private accumulations of material that reinforced organizational values, unit values, and memory, and became, partly because no one really knew what to do with them as the collections grew, that became public. And I think that that sort of material continues to make sense in an inward cultural way, as the memory of the regiment, where these regiments still exist, and in many cases now in the British Army of today, as I think David will contradict me, is very, very small compared to what we were talking about at the time. So it still makes sense as corporate memory within, and that is largely divorced from these bigger issues. But the small military museums as public museums, which are in receipt of public funding and try to reach audiences that are not solely concerned with or solely part of that family of people that were connected to the regiment, and often now staffed by civilian curators and so on. That's the question that they're grappling with, and part of our purposes in putting the project together, the book's one of the outputs, was to try and have these kinds of discussions and not just take from the military museum world as far as evidence and information is concerned, but also to help our colleagues discuss these kinds of issues so that they can represent that kind of material with greater care and greater confidence, whatever the bigger questions might be.
And one of the questions I think is worth asking is there a post-colonial version of a military museum that comes from within a military discussion itself? Mm-hmm. So that if you take sort of the post-colonial debate as we understand it and recognize it and discuss it within kind of national collections or world cultures collections, can you really, in all consciousness, just port that over to military museums? Or is there a post-colonial discussion within the military itself and amongst military people that can find different ways of resolving those issues that are distinct from the post-colonial debate as happens within museum anthropology? And I think that is quite a valid question.
But I think that is actually a beautiful question that I would love, because I think I'd like Staci Marie to respond to that. That's what you were going to do, Staci? Yes, because I think that there's something nice about that, and I don't want to give you my experience yet from working with the same military museum that Staci used to work in, because I have an answer to that question from that experience. Go ahead, Staci, first.
Well, I think for the time that I was at the military museum, I found myself with that same question, because it is a museum of indoctrination. It is a museum of celebrating the trophies. It is a museum that celebrates the victories. However, when you tour the public, because it's a museum that's open to the public, so it's not just for the military, there are questions of colonial violence, the fact that all these battle honors are celebrating violence in Africa where enslaved persons came from. So it's a question of, for me as the curator, it was a question of how can we revisit, how can we reconcile this aspect of the history in terms of not just telling the story of victory, but telling the story of the experience. And for me, one of the ways in which I did that was to host an exhibition that juxtaposed the regimental silvers with the ethnographic objects from the Institute of Jamaica's African collection that really showcase who these people were. So these battle honors weren't just, it's not just, it's putting a face somewhat to these objects and bringing it into context. It's showing the weapons from the other side and giving a face to those people so that we can, to some extent, tell a complete story rather than just a story of victory, but a story of battle, essentially, and what the battle was really about.
And I think that at stake in that, and I think that Staci ends with it really nicely, because it ties back to something you said, Stuart, that at the end of the day, even the military museum in Jamaica was also a museum that was about organizational value, unit value, and corporate memory. It was about that. And that made it very complex to deal with the question of the post-colonial in a country that is fundamentally post-colonial, with Rastafari, reggae, with all of that that's going on, that is critiquing empire. The military museum juxtaposes itself in a very tense way. And so one of the questions that it asks, even at the periphery, and I think that that's one of the things that I think would be beautiful for your project, to expand the idea of British. Because one of the things that Jamaica has, which also is here with everywhere, is how do you even adopt a post-colonial understanding of the military when every year you still have to celebrate Jamaicans' involvement in the First World War? Every year you have to honor the military men who were a part of the World War, right? Which was also, so that tension is not just an imperial Europe tension, it is also a tension that happens outside as well. And that is a part of the battle space of what is at stake in the complex entanglement of how colonialism I think overlaps with so many of the concerns that we're trying to deal with in the present, to try and imagine different kind of worlds. I want to close with one thing by bringing together something David mentioned, and ask Henrietta to do something with this last thing. Can the military collection be conscripted into a narrative of repair, healing, and how might it? Because that's what David was saying, right? To bring it back was, what word did you use, David? I can't remember. The guy was trying to repair some historical injustice or doing something wrong, repent, whatever. How might the military be a part of military collections? Help us imagine that reparative futures that we're trying to think of.
So sometimes, I mean, so obviously military history is not my, it's not my first intellectual vocation. And obviously it is underscored by violence and conflict. But I think one of the ways, so I have been struck when I've talked to people who run military museums and who work in military museums of the effective value of these objects to them. And so when I've talked to people in military museums, so that if you hold the objects as sacred, you hold them. They are in a sense not trophies in the sense that we think of as, you know, sort of reasoned objects of value. They are objects of value to you in a sentimental way that is deeply connected to your past and your memory, and I think to the experience of conflict, which I think puts one way or the other your life in danger. And I think there is a conversation to be had about what those objects mean to a group of people and how they can then understand what they mean to another group of people. I mean, and that comes back to David's point about the bugle, right? So I think that there is a way in which these objects are supercharged, and a way in which they're supercharged in the way that we might, you know, so anthropologists might recognize that when you look at something that's seemingly indistinct but has a huge emotional value for someone in another part of the world, there is that element which takes them beyond the kind of reason and enlightenment view of the convention of a museum.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the post-colonial conversation can happen, because, you know, it's not like the British military is one group of people anymore, but it might be very small, but, you know, it includes people that don't necessarily share the heritage that the British military did in the past. So I think that's where the conversation can happen. I think it's a different conversation than you would have in a national institution and a World Cultures Collection, because actually the effective values around these objects, their emotional charge is much greater. So it's a different conversation, but I think it is a potential conversation around essentially the hierarchy, the regime of value of objects in a military context, which is distinct.
And you know, I want to close there, and you closed for me, Henrietta, beautifully by speaking to that regime of value. And this closure is a closure to say thank you for starting something. So I'm just going to burden you with more work by saying that you've started something that has so much more that one could explore. So I want to ask you whether or not within the context, and Henrietta and I are now in a new project that we call Pressing Matter, which we've gotten funding for, which is trying to look at more critically at collections collected in the colonial period and find ways of thinking again about what they might mean, both for return, but also for how we understand colonial histories better. So within that context, I want to charge Stuart and Henrietta with something else. Let us have this conversation again. Let us pick out a few of those points, the salient points that we've been brought out today. Staci's demand for us to think from another location, from another positionality, from the periphery of empire in a way. Stuart's, David's thinking around the question of ethics, around the moral equality of competence as he describes it. Let us take this conversation again, and I want to ask you whether or not early next year we can organize, when we are safe to travel, a bigger conversation with a set of work groups, panels, where we can go more deeply into some of what we were not able to speak about today. I want to, yes,
sorry.
go ahead.
Well, it's just to say that the postdoc who worked with us, Nicole Hartwell, is actually doing quite a lot of this work with the Indian Army. So her work is now looking at that in relationship to Indian campaigns.
And that is already beautiful. So Nicole, you're invited to the next meeting, and we're going to put you together in a panel with Staci Marie, and that's wonderful. So we can think of empire bigger. And with you, David, I'd love to have another conversation that is one of ethics, and how we might trace a longer history of that within questions of military might. You know, in a way, this conversation falls part of our own RCMC, but the National Museum of World Cultures, trying to think again about what our collections can mean for better futures. You know, how we can mobilize these histories to think about the complex, entangled, difficult violence of the colonial past that is a part of our making, and how might we use that as a way of fashioning more just and equitable futures. And that includes a more equitable distribution of things that were taken, and realizing that stealing was a part of what we are complicit in. So this falls part of that, and we'll have much more conversation like this. I want to thank Henrietta and Stuart for a wonderful starting point for a wonderful book, to commend the book for all of us to purchase. It's a little bit expensive, but anyway, I want to thank David for agreeing to and to help us with this critical thinking, and Staci Marie from all the way from Jamaica to participate in this. And thank you, the audience, for being a part of this. We continue these conversations. As some of you might know, this one is around material culture, but next week we'll have a conversation around the question of race, racism, and anti-racism, looking primarily at the questions surrounding the study of physical anthropology. And that will be next week on the 21st. So we are invested in this ongoing conversation as we build another kind of museum here in the Netherlands, but hopefully that we help our colleagues around the world as we try to do this in all humility. Now, the audience will now leave, and I wish for you a wonderful rest of your evening or afternoon or morning with Staci. And we will have, I think, a conversation with students now for about to end the conversation. Thank you all. Until next time.